The metal spoon scraped against the aluminum tray as Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez stirred her lukewarm beef stew. The familiar sounds of the mess hall creating a backdrop of normalcy that would soon become a distant memory. Around her, 12 of the Navy's most elite warriors laughed and shared stories, their voices mixing with the hum of generators and the distant rumble of waves against the forward operating base's concrete barriers. In less than 6 hours, half of them would be dead, and Sarah would find herself facing a choice that would define not just her military career, but her very survival. The enemy had been watching, waiting, learning their routines. They knew exactly when the SEAL team would be most vulnerable, and they knew exactly who among them posed the greatest threat to their operation. What they didn't know was that the quiet intelligence analyst they dismissed as a secondary target had spent her childhood learning to fight from a father who believed his daughter should never be anyone's victim. They didn't know about the promise she'd made to herself the day she enlisted, or the fire that burned behind her calm exterior. The mess hall was about to become ground zero for a battle that would test every limit of human endurance, tactical skill, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of military service. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to surrender would turn a catastrophic ambush into a legendary fight for survival. Sarah Martinez had learned long ago that normalcy was a luxury in her line of work, but as she sat in the mess hall of forward operating Base Serpent, watching her teammates argue over whether the Chiefs would make it to the playoffs, she allowed herself to sink into the comfortable rhythm of military routine. The base, carved into the rocky coastline of a country most Americans couldn't pronounce, had been home to Task Force Blackwater for the past 4 months. Their mission was simple in concept, complex in execution: gather intelligence on a growing terrorist network that had been targeting American interests across the region. The overhead fluorescent lights cast their familiar harsh glow across the utilitarian space, illuminating the weathered faces of men and women who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments their country could offer. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Bull Rodriguez sat across from her, his massive frame somehow folded into the standard-issue plastic chair, gesticulating wildly as he defended his team's quarterback. To his left, Petty Officer Second Class James Ghost Patterson picked at his food with a methodical precision that had earned him his reputation as the team's best sniper. Sarah found herself cataloging details without thinking about it, a habit that had served her well in her role as the team's intelligence analyst. The way Petty Officer Thompson kept checking his watch, probably thinking about the video call with his pregnant wife scheduled for later that evening. How Seaman Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, nervously tapped his fingers against his tray, the rhythm matching the cadence of the Morse code he'd been practicing for his communications advancement exam. These observations came naturally to her now, after 6 years in the Navy and 2 with Special Operations. She'd learned that survival often depended on noticing the details others missed, whether that meant identifying potential security threats in a crowd of civilians or recognizing when one of her teammates was struggling with something they couldn't quite articulate. Tonight, everyone seemed normal, relaxed even, which should have been reassuring. Instead, Sarah felt an uncomfortable knot forming in her stomach. The feeling had started during the morning briefing when Lieutenant Commander Hayes had announced a change in their patrol schedule. Nothing dramatic, just a shift from their usual evening reconnaissance to an early morning sweep of the coastal villages. Hayes had explained it as an opportunity to catch their targets off guard, but something about the way he'd avoided eye contact when delivering the news had set off alarm bells in Sarah's mind. She'd spent the afternoon reviewing intercept from the past week, looking for any indication that their operational security had been compromised. The task force had been incredibly successful in their mission, mapping out the terrorist network structure and identifying key personnel. Too successful, perhaps. In her experience, when things went too smoothly, it usually meant the enemy was planning something. The intercepts painted a picture of increased activity among their targets, but nothing concrete enough to warrant changing their plans. Coded messages had increased in frequency over the past 48 hours, but the encryption was too sophisticated for the field equipment to crack in real time. She'd flagged the communications for analysis by the team back at headquarters, but that process could take days. Bull's laughter interrupted her thoughts, the sound echoing off the metal walls of the mess hall. He'd apparently won his argument about football and was now launching into a story about his hometown in Texas. Sarah forced herself to focus on the conversation, recognizing that her analytical mind sometimes pulled her too far into her work. That was when she noticed something that made the knot in her stomach tighten further. Seaman Rodriguez, the youngest member of their team at barely 19, was staring at his untouched tray of food with an expression that didn't match the jovial atmosphere. His usual enthusiasm was nowhere to be found, replaced by a tension that seemed to radiate from his shoulders down through his entire posture. When he thought no one was looking, he kept glancing toward the mess hall in trance with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was expecting something. Sarah caught his eye across the table and gave him a questioning look. Rodriguez quickly looked away, but not before she saw something that made her blood run cold. Fear. Not the normal pre-mission nervousness that affected everyone from time to time, but genuine, bone-deep terror. She was about to ask him what was wrong when the lights went out. The mess hall plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of black that seemed to press against your eyeballs and make you question whether you'd actually open them. For a moment, the only sound was the collective intake of breath from 13 surprised voices. Then training kicked in. "Everyone stay calm," came Chief Rodriguez's voice from across the table, steady and authoritative despite the circumstances. "Probably just a generator problem. Sarah, you still have that tactical light." Sarah was already reaching for the small LED flashlight clipped to her belt when she heard something that made her freeze. From somewhere near the entrance to the mess hall came the soft metallic click of a safety being disengaged. Then another, and another. The darkness exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the mess hall like deadly strobe lights as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions around the room. The tactical part of Sarah's mind registered that the attackers had been waiting in position before the lights went out, which meant this wasn't an opportunistic assault. This was a carefully planned ambush. She rolled backward off her chair, hitting the concrete floor hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Around her, she could hear her teammates shouting orders and returning fire, their voices mixing with the deafening cacophony of gunshots and ricochets. The metal tables provided some cover, but she knew it wouldn't last long against sustained automatic weapons fire. A hand grabbed her shoulder, and she nearly struck out before recognizing Ghost's voice in her ear. "Stay low and follow me. We need to get to the armory." The armory was at the far end of the base, through 2 corridors and past the communication center. It might as well have been on the moon, but Ghost was already moving, keeping low and using the overturned tables for concealment. Sarah followed, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. The attack was too coordinated to be random. Someone had known exactly where the team would be and when they would be most vulnerable. The power had been cut at precisely the moment when all 13 members of the task force were gathered in one location, away from their weapons and equipment. This level of intelligence could only come from someone with intimate knowledge of their operations. They made it halfway to the mess hall exit before Sarah heard Ghost grunt and stumble. Even in the darkness, she could see the spreading wetness on his shoulder where a bullet had found its mark. She caught him before he could fall, feeling the warm stickiness of blood against her hands. "I'm okay," he whispered, but his voice was tight with pain. "Keep moving." They pressed forward, Sarah now taking point while Ghost leaned heavily on her shoulder. Behind them, the firefight continued, but the sound of friendly fire was diminishing. Either her teammates were running low on ammunition, or there were fewer of them left to fight. She forced herself not to think about which option was more likely. They reached the corridor leading away from the mess hall just as a new sound joined the battle, the distinctive whine of incoming mortar rounds. The first explosion shook the entire base, raining concrete dust down from the ceiling and temporarily deafening Sarah's ears. The second hit closer, and she could feel the shock wave in her chest. "They're trying to bring down the whole building," Ghost said, his voice barely audible over the ringing in Sarah's ears. We need to get outside before the third mortar round hit directly above them. The corridor collapsed in a cascade of concrete and twisted metal, cutting off their escape route and separating them from the rest of the base. Sarah felt herself falling as the floor gave way beneath them, Ghost's weight pulling her sideways into what felt like a maintenance tunnel. They landed hard in ankle-deep water that smelled of rust and diesel fuel. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah's entire body felt like one giant bruise, and she could taste blood in her mouth. Slowly, she activated her tactical light, its narrow beam revealing that they'd fallen into some kind of drainage system that ran beneath the base. The tunnel stretched away in both directions, disappearing into darkness. Ghost was unconscious, his breathing shallow, but steady. The bullet wound in his shoulder was still bleeding, but not arterially. She could stabilize him, but they needed to find shelter and medical supplies. More importantly, they needed to figure out what had happened to the rest of their team. As if summoned by her thoughts, voices echoed down the tunnel from the direction of the base. Foreign voices, speaking in a language she recognized but couldn't quite place. The tone was celebratory, excited. They were conducting some kind of roll call or head count. Sarah extinguished her light and pressed herself against the tunnel wall, listening. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the splash of boots in the standing water. Flashlight beams began to dance across the tunnel walls, growing brighter as the search party approached their position. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they were discovered. Ghost needed medical attention that she couldn't provide here. The rest of her team was either dead or captured, and she had no way to contact headquarters for support. The enemy clearly knew more about the base's layout than she'd realized, and they were conducting an organized search for survivors. Every piece of tactical training she'd ever received told her that their situation was hopeless. The smart play was surrender and hope for eventual rescue or prisoner exchange. But as she listened to the approaching voices, Sarah remembered something her father had told her during one of their weekend training sessions in the woods behind their house in North Carolina. She'd been 12 years old, frustrated after failing to complete an obstacle course he'd set up for her. "Baby girl," he'd said, his voice gentle but firm, "there's going to come a time when everything looks impossible, when everyone's telling you to quit, and quitting seems like the only logical choice. That's when you'll find out who you really are. Not when things are easy, but when they're impossible." The voices were close enough now that she could smell cigarette smoke and hear individual words. In maybe 10 seconds, flashlight beams would illuminate their hiding spot. Ghost was completely dependent on her for survival, and she was completely dependent on her own skills and determination. Sarah Martinez had never been in a truly impossible situation before. As the enemy search team rounded the corner of the drainage tunnel, their lights beginning to probe the shadows where she and Ghost lay hidden, she was about to find out exactly who she really was when everything seemed hopeless. The first flashlight beam swept past them, missing their position by inches. Sarah held her breath, her hand instinctively moving to the combat knife on her belt. It was the only weapon she had left, and she was about to face at least 3 armed enemies in a confined space while protecting an unconscious teammate. The odds were mathematically impossible, which was exactly the kind of challenge that her father had trained her for her entire life. The second flashlight beam was heading directly toward Ghost's outstretched leg when Sarah made her choice. Instead of waiting to be discovered, she rolled forward into the tunnel, coming up in a crouch behind the lead searcher. Her knife found the space between his neck and body armor before he could cry out, and she was already moving toward the second man as the first one collapsed. The impossible had just become inevitable. The second enemy fighter's flashlight beam wavered as he tried to process what had just happened to his partner, but Sarah was already inside his guard. Her knife found the vulnerable spot just below his rib cage, angled upward toward the heart with surgical precision. He dropped without making a sound, his weapon clattering into the water beside him. The third man, positioned further back in the tunnel, had enough time to raise his rifle before Sarah's tactical light blazed directly into his eyes. Temporarily blinded, he fired wild, the muzzle flash illuminating the tunnel walls in stark detail, but missing his target completely. Sarah used his momentary disorientation to close the distance, grabbing the barrel of his weapon and redirecting it toward the tunnel ceiling as her knee drove up into his solar plexus. He folded over, gasping for breath, and Sarah's elbow strike to the back of his neck ended the fight permanently. 3 men down in less than 15 seconds. Sarah's hands were shaking as adrenaline flooded her system, but her mind was already moving to the next problem. She quickly searched the bodies, retrieving weapons, ammunition, and communication equipment. The rifles were AK-47 variants, well-maintained but showing signs of extensive use. The comm gear was more sophisticated than she'd expected, suggesting these weren't local militants but part of a larger, well-funded organization. She found something else that made her blood run cold. Detailed blueprints of the base, marked with precise locations of critical infrastructure, defensive positions, and personnel quarters. Someone had provided the enemy with intelligence that only someone with extensive access to classified materials could possess. This wasn't just an attack, it was a betrayal. Ghost stirred as she returned to his position, his eyes flickering open with the unfocused look of someone fighting through pain and disorientation. Sarah? What happened to the search team? They won't be reporting back, she said simply, helping him sit up against the tunnel wall. But there'll be more coming. We need to move. She used supplies from the enemy fighter's medical kits to create a pressure bandage for Ghost's shoulder wound. The bullet had passed through clean, missing any major arteries or bones, but he lost enough blood to make him weak and unsteady. He could move, but not quickly or quietly. The rest of the team? He asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah shook her head. I heard voices upstairs during the search. Enemy voices doing some kind of head count. If anyone else made it out, they're not in the base anymore. Ghost closed his eyes, processing the information. When he opened them again, his expression had shifted from pain to something harder and more focused. So what's the plan? That was the question Sarah had been dreading. Standard operating procedure in this situation was clear: evade, escape, and report back to headquarters. Find a way to get off the base, reach a safe communications point, and call in support. Let the professionals handle rescue operations and retaliation. But the communications center was in the heart of the base, almost certainly under enemy control. The motor pool was similarly compromised, and their normal extraction points would be monitored. Even if they could somehow get a message out, rescue would take hours or days to organize. Ghost needed medical attention that couldn't wait that long, and Sarah had seen enough of the enemy's planning to know they wouldn't be content with just holding the base. More importantly, if the attack had been as successful as it appeared, there might not be anyone left to rescue. We're going back in, she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. If there are survivors, they're prisoners now. The enemy has too much intel about our operations to have gotten it from interrogating locals. There's a leak somewhere, and until we know how deep it goes, we can't trust normal channels. Ghost stared at her as if she'd suggested they sprout wings and fly home. Sarah, there are 2 of us against what sounds like a full assault team. I can barely stand up, and you're an intelligence analyst, not a combat specialist. This is suicide. He was absolutely right, of course. Everything about the situation argued for retreat and regrouping. But as Sarah thought about the voices she'd heard upstairs, celebrating their victory while her teammates lay dead or captured, she felt something cold and implacable settle in her chest. My father was a Marine, she said quietly. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Beirut. He used to tell me stories about impossible situations, times when the smart thing to do was quit and the right thing to do was the exact opposite. He said that's how you find out who you really are. She stood up, checking the action on one of the captured rifles. Ghost, I've been analyzing enemy tactics for 2 years. I know how they think, how they plan, what they expect. They planned for a conventional response to this attack. They haven't planned for two supposedly dead Americans to come hunting them in their own captured territory. And if we get ourselves killed in the process? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then, we die trying to save our team instead of running away. I can live with that choice. Can you live with the other one? Ghost was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dim glow of the tactical light. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, but we do this smart. No heroic charges or dramatic gestures. We gather intelligence first, figure out exactly what we're dealing with, then make a plan that doesn't require divine intervention to succeed. Agreed. Can you move quietly with that shoulder? Quietly enough. The adrenaline's helping with the pain, and these tunnels seem to connect to different parts of the base. If we can find access points near the communication center or the detention facility, we might be able to get a better picture of the situation. Sarah nodded, already thinking through possible approaches. The base's drainage system had been designed to handle flash flooding during the rainy season, which meant the tunnels needed to connect to every major building. If the enemy was focused on securing the surface structures, they might have overlooked the underground access points. They began moving deeper into the tunnel system, Sarah taking point, while Ghost followed at a distance that would allow him to provide covering fire if they encountered another search team. The water was deeper here, reaching nearly to their knees, and the smell of diesel fuel was stronger. Somewhere ahead, she could hear the steady rhythm of mechanical equipment, possibly backup generators powering the enemy's communication gear. The tunnel branched frequently, with smaller passages splitting off toward different sections of the base. Sarah tried to maintain a mental map of their route, but the identical concrete walls and lack of landmarks made navigation challenging. They needed to find a way to the surface where they could get their bearings and assess the tactical situation. After 20 minutes of careful movement, they reached a section where ladder rungs set into the wall led upward to what appeared to be a maintenance access hatch. Light filtered down from around the edges, suggesting it opened into an occupied area. Sarah climbed carefully, pressing her ear to the metal cover and trying to identify sounds from above. She could hear voices, but they were distant and unclear. More importantly, she could smell something that made her stomach clench with a mixture of rage and determination. The distinctive odor of zip tie restraints and military MREs. Someone was being held prisoner directly above them. She descended quietly and motioned for Ghost to move closer. Prisoners, she whispered. At least one, maybe more. The question is whether we can extract them without alerting the entire enemy force. What's the layout up there? Can't tell from down here. We need visual confirmation before we do anything. Sarah paused, thinking through their limited options. There's another access point about 50 meters ahead. If we can get eyes on the area from multiple angles, we might be able to identify guard positions and prisoner locations. They continued through the tunnel system, moving with painful slowness to avoid making noise that might alert anyone above. The second access point led to what appeared to be a storage area, based on the muffled sounds of equipment being moved around. The third opened into complete silence. Sarah ascended this ladder with extreme caution, using her knife to slowly lift the access cover just enough to peer through the gap. What she saw made her heart race with a mixture of hope and tactical dread. They were looking into the base's main conference room, which had been converted into a temporary detention facility. 7 members of her team sat with their backs against the far wall, secured with zip ties and guarded by 2 enemy fighters. She could see Chief Rodriguez, Petty Officer Thompson, and 5 others. They were alive, but all showed signs of rough treatment, and Thompson appeared to be unconscious. More troubling was what she couldn't see. The room's normal capacity was for briefings of up to 20 personnel, but the current arrangement suggested the enemy was using only part of the space. That meant guards or equipment in areas she couldn't observe from her current position. She was about to descend and report her findings to Ghost when movement near the room's main entrance caught her attention. A figure in enemy fatigues was entering, but something about his bearing made her look more carefully. It was Seaman Rodriguez, the young team member who'd been acting strangely during dinner. He was no longer restrained. no longer showing any signs of fear or stress. Instead, he was speaking animatedly with one of the guards in what sounded like fluent Arabic. The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rodriguez had been with the team for 8 months, long enough to learn their routines, their security protocols, their operational plans. Long enough to provide the detailed intelligence that had made this attack possible. The nervous behavior she'd noticed during dinner hadn't been fear of what was coming. It had been guilt over what he was about to do. She watched as Rodriguez pointed toward the detention area and said something that made the guards laugh. Then he gestured toward a corridor leading deeper into the base, the direction that would take him toward the communications center. He was providing updates to his handlers, reporting on the success of the operation, and probably coordinating the next phase of their plan. Sarah descended the ladder with her mind racing. The situation had just become significantly more complex and dangerous. Not only were they facing a well-armed enemy force in fortified positions, but that force had inside intelligence about American capabilities, personnel, and likely rescue protocols. "What did you see?" Ghost whispered as she reached the tunnel floor. 7 survivors in the conference room, 2 guards that I could identify, and one very big problem. Sarah quickly explained what she'd observed about Rodriguez's betrayal. Ghost's expression grew progressively grimmer as she spoke. "That changes everything. If Rodriguez has been feeding them intelligence for months, they know about our emergency protocols, our backup communication systems, probably even our extraction procedures. Any rescue attempt is going to walk straight into a trap. Which means we're the only chance those 7 people have," Sarah said. "The question is whether we can take the room without getting them killed in the crossfire. 2 guards, multiple entry points, unknown number of additional hostiles in adjacent areas. Even if we could neutralize the immediate threats, the sound of gunfire would bring reinforcements before we could extract the prisoners." Sarah nodded, then stopped as an idea began forming in her mind. What if we don't extract them? What if we give them the tools to extract themselves? She quickly outlined her plan. It was risky and required precise timing, but it leveraged their few advantages: surprise, intimate knowledge of the base layout, and the enemy's assumption that all American personnel were either dead or captured. Ghost listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as he recognized the tactical soundness of different elements. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "It could work," he said finally, "but if anything goes wrong, we'll have turned a hostage situation into a massacre. Are you sure you want that responsibility?" Sarah thought about Chief Rodriguez, who had recommended her for advancement twice and never failed to ask about her family during their weekly calls home. About Petty Officer Thompson, who carried pictures of his unborn daughter and had already picked out names for the baby his wife was expecting. About the 6 other professionals who had trusted their lives to military training and American support that had failed them completely. "I'm sure," she said, "but first we need to deal with our friend Rodriguez. If he's providing real-time intelligence to the enemy, our plan won't survive contact with reality." Ghost's smile was cold and professional. "Leave Rodriguez to me. Just get me close enough, and I'll make sure his intelligence updates become significantly less accurate." Sarah looked at her wounded teammate, seeing past the pain and blood loss to the hardcore determination that had made him one of the Navy's most effective special operations personnel. Ghost might be operating at reduced capacity, but his core skills remained intact. "All right," she said, checking her watch and starting to calculate timing requirements. "Phase 1 begins in 15 minutes. After that, we're committed to seeing this through to whatever end we find." As they began moving through the tunnel system toward the communications center, Sarah felt the same cold certainty that had driven her father through 3 combat tours and 2 decades of military service. The situation was still impossible, the odds still mathematically hopeless. But impossibility, she was beginning to understand, was just another tactical problem to be solved. And she was very good at solving problems. The communications center occupied the most secure section of the base, built into the natural rock formation that formed the facility's foundation. Under normal circumstances, it was protected by multiple layers of security, including biometric scanners, reinforced steel doors, and armed sentries. Now, as Sarah and Ghost approached through the maintenance tunnels, they could hear the steady hum of equipment and conversation that indicated the enemy had not only captured the facility intact, but was actively using it for their own purposes. Sarah positioned herself at the tunnel access point closest to the center, while Ghost moved to a secondary position that would give him line of sight to the corridor leading away from the communications room. Their plan required precise coordination and timing that left no room for error or hesitation. Through the access grate, Sarah could see into a storage room adjacent to the main communications center. The space was currently unoccupied, but she could hear voices from the next room over, including one that made her jaw clench with suppressed anger. Rodriguez was providing a status report in heavily accented English, obviously speaking to someone who didn't share his language skills. All American personnel accounted for, Rodriguez was saying. 7 prisoners secured in the conference room. 6 confirmed dead in the initial assault. No indication of additional survivors or successful escape attempts. A different voice responded in what sounded like Russian, too fast and too muffled for Sarah to understand. Rodriguez replied in the same language, his fluency suggesting this wasn't his first conversation with foreign handlers. How long had he been compromised? How many operations had been endangered by his betrayal? Sarah forced herself to focus on the immediate tactical situation rather than the larger implications of what she was hearing. Through the storage room's interior window, she could see into the main communications center. 3 enemy operators were working at the facility's equipment banks, while a 4th stood guard near the reinforced entrance. Rodriguez was positioned at what had been the base commander's workstation, apparently coordinating between the assault team and external command elements. The setup confirmed what Sarah had suspected. This wasn't a hit-and-run raid, but the first phase of a larger operation. The enemy intended to hold the base and use its communications equipment for their own purposes. That suggested they had additional forces incoming, possibly a full occupation force that would make any rescue attempt exponentially more difficult. She activated the small tactical radio they'd taken from one of the search team members, using a frequency Ghost would be monitoring. Target acquired, she whispered. 4 hostiles plus primary. Guards appear minimal. Ready for Phase 1. Ghost response was barely audible. Corridor secure. Ready on your signal. Sarah checked her watch. According to their timeline, she had 3 minutes to get into position for the next phase of their plan. That meant neutralizing the immediate threats in the communications center while avoiding any actions that would alert the guards holding their teammates. She used her knife to carefully work the access grate loose, moving slowly to avoid any metallic sounds that might carry into the next room. The conversations were continuing, with Rodriguez apparently receiving instructions about prisoner interrogation schedules and information requirements. Sarah caught enough fragments to understand that the enemy was particularly interested in intelligence about other American operations in the region. The storage room access went smoothly, Sarah emerging from the tunnel system into a space filled with spare equipment and supply boxes. The interior window looking into the communications center was positioned to give her a clear view of the entire room, but the angle would also expose her to observation if any of the occupants looked in her direction. She positioned herself carefully, using a stack of equipment boxes for concealment while maintaining visual contact with all 5 targets. Rodriguez was still focused on his conversation with the external command element, his back turned toward her position. The guard at the door was facing away from the storage room, watching the corridor for approaching threats. 2 of the 3 equipment operators had their attention completely focused on their work, while the 3rd was dividing his time between his console and a conversation with Rodriguez. Sarah activated her radio again, speaking barely above a whisper. Phase 1. Execute in 10 seconds. She drew the captured pistol from her belt and checked the chamber. 7 rounds available, 5 targets, no margin for error. The room's layout would allow her to engage 2 targets immediately upon entry, but the remaining 3 would have time to react and return fire. Success depended on speed, accuracy, and the enemy's assumption that all threats had been neutralized. The storage room's interior door was unlocked, a small blessing that would allow her to enter the communications center without warning sounds. She positioned herself next to the doorframe, took a deep breath, and began her count. On 0, Sarah burst through the door. The guard at the entrance was turning toward the sound when her first shot took him center mass. Rodriguez looked up from his console in confusion just as her second shot punched through the center of his chest, the impact throwing him backward into the communications equipment. The nearest equipment operator was reaching for a rifle propped against his workstation when Sarah's third shot dropped him to the floor. The fourth and fifth targets had enough time to recognize the threat and begin reacting, but not enough time to effectively respond. Sarah's fourth shot caught the second equipment operator as he was rising from his chair, while her fifth shot took the third man as he brought a pistol up toward her position. 5 targets down in less than 8 seconds. The communications center was secure, but Sarah knew she had perhaps 2 minutes before someone would notice the lack of radio chatter or come to investigate. She moved quickly to the main console, looking for the equipment that would allow her to contact the outside world. The enemy had been using the base's own communication systems, which meant the encryption protocols and frequency settings were already established. Sarah activated the emergency beacon that would alert headquarters to the situation, then began uploading the intelligence data they'd gathered from the capture documents. If she and Ghost didn't survive the next phase of their operation, at least someone would know about Rodriguez's betrayal and the enemy's capabilities. The upload was taking longer than she'd hoped when Ghost's voice crackled over her radio. Multiple hostiles moving toward your position. Estimate 2 minutes before arrival. Sarah swore under her breath and began the process of sabotaging the communications equipment. If they couldn't hold the center, she at least wanted to deny its use to the enemy. She used the thermite grenades from the emergency kit to disable the main transmitters, then gathered the intelligence materials and prepared to withdraw. Communications center is compromised, she radioed to Ghost. Moving to Phase 2. Phase 2 required them to reach the conference room where their teammates were being held, neutralize the guards, and provide the prisoners with weapons and tactical information that would allow them to fight their way out. It was the most dangerous part of their plan, requiring them to move through areas of the base that were certainly under enemy control and probably under active patrol. Sarah made her way back to the tunnel system as the sound of approaching boots echoed through the corridor outside the communications center. She could hear shouting in multiple languages as the enemy discovered the bodies and realized they had active threats somewhere in the facility. The advantage of surprise was gone now. Every step from this point forward would be contested, and the enemy would be actively hunting for the American survivors who had turned from victims into predators. But they'd accomplished their first objective. Rodriguez was dead, which meant the enemy's intelligence advantage had been significantly reduced. Sarah reached the tunnel junction where Ghost was waiting, noting that his face was pale and his breathing was more labored than it had been an hour ago. The blood loss was taking its toll, but his eyes remained focused and alert. "Status?" he asked as she approached. "Communications center neutralized. Emergency beacon activated. Intelligence uploaded. Rodriguez is permanently out of the information business." Sarah checked her remaining ammunition. "But they know we're here now. The next phase is going to be significantly more difficult. Movement upstairs has increased significantly," Ghost reported. "Sounds like they're conducting organized sweeps of each section. They'll find the tunnel access points eventually." Sarah nodded, studying the rough map she'd sketched of the tunnel system. "That gives us maybe 30 minutes before they start hunting us down here. We need to reach the conference room, neutralize the guards, and arm the prisoners before they reorganize their security. And then we fight our way out together, or we die together. Those are the only 2 options that don't involve abandoning our teammates." Ghost smiled grimly. "I've had worse odds, although not recently." They began moving through the tunnels toward the conference room, traveling as quickly as Ghost's condition would allow. The sound of activity above them was increasing with multiple conversations and the movement of heavy equipment. Sarah tried to identify patterns that would tell her about enemy strength and positioning, but the overlapping voices and echoing acoustics made detailed analysis impossible. What was clear was that they were facing a much larger force than she'd initially estimated. The conversations she could make out suggested at least 20 enemy fighters, possibly more, with heavy weapons and communications equipment that extended far beyond what would be needed for a simple raid on the base. They reached the access point below the conference room to find that the situation had changed significantly since Sarah's initial reconnaissance. The sound from above indicated increased activity with multiple voices and the movement of personnel. Either additional prisoners had been brought in, or the guard force had been reinforced. Sarah climbed the access ladder carefully, listening for any indication of what they would be facing. Through the grate, she could see that the prisoner count had indeed changed, but not in the way she'd expected. Instead of additional American prisoners, several enemy fighters were using the conference room as a staging area while the original guards maintained watch over their 7 teammates. The new tactical situation was significantly more complex. Instead of 2 guards to neutralize, they were now facing at least 6 enemy fighters in a space with limited cover and multiple exit points. Any engagement would immediately escalate into a running firefight with odds that approached the mathematically impossible. Sarah descended to brief Ghost on the changed situation, her mind racing through alternative approaches. Every tactical solution she could envision resulted in dead hostages, dead rescuers, or both. They needed a new approach, something that would change the fundamental dynamics of the situation. That was when she heard something that made her reconsider their entire plan. From somewhere above, carried through the base's ventilation system, came the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters. Multiple aircraft, flying in formation, approaching from the direction of the sea. Either rescue had arrived much faster than anyone could have predicted, or the enemy's reinforcements were landing earlier than scheduled. Given the sophistication of the attack and the enemy's obvious preparation, Sarah suspected the latter. "Ghost," she whispered urgently. "We need to get topside. Those helicopters could change everything, and we need to know whether they're carrying friends or additional enemies." "What about the prisoners?" Sarah looked up toward the conference room, thinking about her 7 teammates who were depending on rescue that might never come. "If those helicopters are bringing enemy reinforcements, our teammates are dead no matter what we do. If they're bringing rescue forces, those forces need to know what they're flying into." It was a cold calculation that went against every instinct she had about leaving team members behind. But tactical reality demanded choices that prioritized the mission over individual survival, even when those individuals were people she cared about. Besides, she added, if we can identify friendly forces and establish communication with them, we might be able to coordinate a rescue that actually has a chance of success. Ghost nodded slowly. Surface access is going to be significantly more dangerous now that they know we're active. Everything about this is dangerous. But staying in these tunnels while the tactical situation changes above us is just a slower way of getting everyone killed. They began moving toward an access point that would bring them out near the base's helicopter landing pad, the most likely destination for the approaching aircraft. If the helicopters were carrying friendly forces, that was where tactical coordination would need to take place. If they were carrying enemies, that was where the next phase of the battle would be decided. As they moved through the tunnels, Sarah found herself thinking about her father's words about impossible situations and finding out who you really are. She was beginning to understand that the impossible wasn't something you solve through clever tactics or superior firepower. Sometimes the impossible was simply something you endured long enough to see what came next. The sound of helicopters was growing louder, accompanied now by the deeper rumble of heavier aircraft. Whatever was approaching, it was substantial enough to represent a fundamental shift in the tactical balance. Sarah and Ghost were about to discover whether that shift would save their teammates or doom them all. The access ladder leading to the surface near the helicopter pad seemed to stretch endlessly upward as Sarah climbed. each rung bringing her closer to answers that might determine whether her teammates lived or died. Ghost followed below, his breathing increasingly labored but his determination unchanged. The sound of approaching aircraft had grown to a thunderous roar that vibrated through the base's concrete structure. Sarah reached the access hatch and paused, listening carefully for any indication of activity directly above. The aircraft noise was overwhelming now, but underneath it she could hear shouting voices and the sound of personnel moving with urgent purpose. Someone was preparing for the incoming helicopters, but whether that someone was friend or foe remained unclear. She cracked the hatch slightly and peered through the gap. What she saw made her heart sink with a mixture of disappointment and tactical dread. The helicopter pad was swarming with enemy fighters, at least 15 visible from her limited vantage point, all armed with heavy weapons and positioned in defensive formations that suggested they were expecting resistance. More troubling were the preparations they were making. Several fighters were setting up what appeared to be anti-aircraft missile systems, while others were positioning heavy machine guns to cover the landing area. This wasn't a welcoming committee for friendly reinforcements. This was a kill zone designed to destroy any rescue attempt. The approaching helicopters were flying directly into a trap that would turn any rescue mission into a massacre. Sarah opened the hatch wider, trying to get a better view of the aircraft that were now visible on the horizon. For helicopters flying in combat formation, approaching fast and low over the water. Even at this distance, she could see they were American aircraft, probably Marine Corps transport helicopters carrying a rescue force that had no idea what they were flying into. "What do you see?" Ghost whispered from below. "Rescue force inbound. 15+ hostiles in prepared positions with anti-air capabilities. It's going to be a slaughter unless we can warn them off or neutralize the threat." Sarah's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. The approaching helicopters would be in range of the enemy's weapons in less than 3 minutes. She had no way to contact them directly, and even if she could, they were probably already committed to their approach pattern. Military rescue operations didn't abort easily, especially when American lives were at stake. But there might be another option. "Ghost, how much explosives training did you get in advanced operations?" "Enough to be dangerous." "What?" Sarah pointed toward a structure visible through the access hatch. "Fuel depot, maybe 50 meters from the landing pad. If we could create a large enough explosion at the right moment, it might disrupt the enemy's defensive positioning and give the rescue force a chance. Or it might kill everyone in the blast radius, including our teammates in the conference room. The conference room is on the other side of the base. The blast should be directional, focused away from the prisoners." Sarah paused, calculating distances and explosive effects. "It's risky, but if those helicopters land in that kill zone, everyone dies anyway." Ghost was quiet for a moment, processing the tactical situation. "What about the anti-aircraft missiles? Even if we disrupt their positioning, they still have the capability to bring down the helicopters. One problem at a time. First we save the rescue force, then we figure out how to coordinate with them to extract our teammates." The sound of helicopters was close enough now that Sarah could distinguish individual aircraft. For Marine Corps CH-47 Chinooks, configured for combat insertion and capable of carrying a full company of Marines. If they could land safely, the tactical balance would shift dramatically in favor of the Americans. "All right," Ghost said, beginning to climb toward her position. "But we do this smart. Set the charges, get clear, and detonate at the moment that creates maximum disruption with minimum risk to friendly forces." Sarah nodded and pushed the access hatch fully open, emerging onto the surface of the base for the first time since the attack had begun. The scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos, with enemy fighters moving between positions and equipment and preparations that spoke to months of advanced planning. The fuel depot was positioned exactly where she'd remembered, a cluster of storage tanks and pumping equipment that supplied the base's generators and vehicle fleet. More importantly, it was positioned uphill from the helicopter pad, which meant an explosion would send debris and burning fuel downward into the enemy's defensive positions. She and Ghost moved carefully between buildings, using the enemy's focus on the approaching aircraft to mask their movement. The sound of helicopters was loud enough now to drown out most other noise, which helped with concealment, but made communication between them nearly impossible. They reached the fuel depot to find it unguarded, another indication that the enemy had concentrated all available personnel on the landing pad preparations. Sarah began examining the storage tank configurations while Ghost established a defensive position that would give him line of sight to anyone approaching their location. The fuel depot's design was more complex than she'd initially realized. Multiple storage tanks connected by a distribution system that fed pumping stations throughout the base. If she could create a cascading series of explosions rather than a single blast, the effect would be both more dramatic and more sustained. Sarah used the explosives from the enemy equipment they'd captured to create a series of charges positioned at critical points in the fuel distribution system. The timing would be crucial. Too early, and the enemy would have time to reorganize their defenses. Too late, and the helicopters would already be committed to landing in the kill zone. She was connecting the final charge when Ghost's hand on her shoulder made her look up to see 3 enemy fighters approaching their position. They weren't moving with the urgency of people responding to a threat, which suggested they were conducting routine security checks rather than hunting for specific targets. Sarah and Ghost had perhaps 30 seconds before they were discovered. The explosive charges were set, but not armed, and any firefight at this location would alert the entire enemy force to their presence. Once again, they found themselves facing mathematically impossible odds with no good tactical options. That was when Sarah noticed something that changed her entire understanding of their situation. One of the approaching enemy fighters was speaking into a radio, and his words were clear enough for her to understand. American helicopters approaching from the southeast for aircraft, estimated time to landing zone 3 minutes. He was speaking in English, with an accent that suggested military training rather than foreign birth. Either the enemy force included American personnel, or they had equipment sophisticated enough to intercept and understand American military communications in real time. But, more importantly, his report meant someone was monitoring the rescue force's radio traffic and could potentially intercept any communications Sarah might attempt with the incoming helicopters. The trap was more comprehensive than she'd realized, extending beyond simple positioning to include electronic warfare capabilities. The 3 enemy fighters were close enough now that Sarah could see individual equipment details, professional-grade weapons and gear, coordinated movements, and communication discipline that suggested military rather than paramilitary training. These weren't local fighters or terrorist recruits. They were professionals, possibly special operations personnel from a foreign military. Sarah made a series of rapid hand signals to Ghost, indicating the approaching threat and her intention to engage. He nodded and shifted position to provide covering fire while maintaining oversight of the explosive charges. The engagement was brief and violent. Sarah took the first fighter with a knife strike before he could raise his weapon, while Ghost's suppressed pistol accounted for the second. The third fighter managed to get off a burst from his rifle before Sarah's return fire dropped him, but the shots went high and wide. The gunfire, even suppressed, was loud enough to attract attention in the sudden quiet that followed a lull in the helicopter noise. Sarah could hear voices calling out from the direction of the landing pad, asking for status reports from the patrol that would never respond. "We're compromised," Ghost said, moving to arm the explosive charges. "How long until the helicopters are in the kill zone?" Sarah looked toward the approaching aircraft, now visible as distinct shapes against the sky. 2 minutes, maybe less. She began the arming sequence for the explosives, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The charges would create a cascading explosion that should disrupt the enemy's defensive positioning, but timing would be critical to avoid catching the rescue force in the blast. That was when the situation became even more complicated. From the direction of the conference room came the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire, sustained and intense. Either the prisoners had somehow broken free and were fighting their way out, or the enemy had decided to eliminate them rather than risk their rescue. Ghost, we need to. The rest of her sentence was drowned out by the arrival of the helicopters overhead. The lead aircraft was beginning its approach to the landing pad, completely unaware of the kill zone it was entering. Sarah could see the anti-aircraft missile teams tracking the helicopter's descent, their weapons ready to fire the moment the aircraft committed to landing. Sarah had perhaps 10 seconds to decide between saving the rescue force or attempting to save her captured teammates. She couldn't do both, and failure to act would result in everyone dying. The explosive charges were armed and ready. The helicopter was seconds away from the point of no return. Gunfire from the conference room suggested her teammates were either fighting for their lives or already dead. Sarah's finger hovered over the detonation trigger as she faced the most impossible choice of an already impossible situation. Save the rescue force by destroying the enemy's defensive positions, or attempt to reach her teammates who might already be beyond saving. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, words about impossible situations and finding out who you really are. But he never mentioned what happened when every choice led to someone's death, and inaction guaranteed everyone's death. The lead helicopter was 50 feet from touchdown when Sarah saw something that made her decision for her. Muzzle flashes from the windows of the conference room, firing outward toward approaching enemy fighters rather than inward toward prisoners. Her teammates were alive, armed, and fighting back. Sarah pressed the detonation trigger. The fuel depot exploded in a cascading series of blasts that sent burning debris and superheated air rolling down the hillside toward the helicopter pad. Enemy fighters scattered from their positions as fuel tanks continued to detonate in sequence, creating a wall of flame and smoke that obscured the landing zone and disrupted the carefully planned defensive arrangements. The lead helicopter, momentarily blinded by smoke and buffeted by the explosion's shockwave, pulled up hard and began circling for another approach. The other 3 aircraft followed suit, buying precious time for the tactical situation on the ground to develop. But Sarah and Ghost were now trapped between the burning fuel depot and an increasingly organized enemy response. Smoke provided concealment, but it also limited their visibility and mobility. More importantly, their position was becoming untenable as enemy fighters regrouped and began searching for the source of the explosion. Conference room, Ghost said, pointing through the smoke toward the building where gunfire was still echoing. If our people are fighting their way out, they're going to need support. Sarah nodded, checking her remaining ammunition and explosives. They were low on everything except determination and the kind of desperate courage that came from having no good alternatives. As they began moving toward the sound of battle, Sarah realized that her father's words about impossible situations had been incomplete. Sometimes you didn't find out who you really were when everything seemed hopeless. Sometimes you found out who you could become when everyone you cared about depended on you not giving up. The real battle was just beginning. The smoke from the burning fuel depot provided cover as Sarah and Ghost moved toward the conference room, but it also carried the acrid smell of burning chemicals that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. Through the haze, they could hear the ongoing firefight intensifying, with the distinctive sounds of both American M4 rifles and enemy AK-47s creating a deadly symphony of combat. As they approached the building, Sarah could see muzzle flashes through the windows and the occasional silhouette of fighters moving inside. The tactical situation was fluid and chaotic, with neither side holding clear advantage. Her teammates were obviously armed and fighting back, but they were also trapped inside a building surrounded by hostile forces. Ghost grabbed her shoulder and pointed to a secondary entrance that led into the building's maintenance section. If we can get inside and establish a crossfire, we might be able to break their defensive perimeter. Sarah nodded, recognizing the tactical wisdom of a suggestion while also understanding its risks. Once they entered the building, they would be committed to the firefight with limited avenues of retreat. But their teammates were running low on time and options, and the longer the engagement continued, the more likely the enemy was to receive reinforcements or resort to heavy weapons that would end the fight decisively. They reached the maintenance entrance as one of the circling helicopters began another approach to the landing pad. The pilot was using the smoke as concealment, flying low and fast in an attempt to reach the ground before enemy forces could reorganize their air defenses. Sarah could hear the distinctive whine of missiles being fired, followed by the explosive impacts of countermeasures being deployed. The helicopter made it to the ground, but Sarah could see that it had taken damage during the approach. Smoke was trailing from its engine compartment, and the landing had been harder than intended. Marines were already pouring out of the aircraft, establishing a defensive perimeter and moving with the kind of disciplined aggression that suggested they understood the tactical situation they'd entered. But the other 3 helicopters were still circling, unable to land while enemy anti-aircraft capabilities remained active. The rescue force was partially deployed, but fragmented, with limited numbers on the ground and the rest of their strength trapped in the air. Sarah and Ghost entered the building through the maintenance access, immediately encountering the sound and confusion of close-quarters combat. Through interior windows, they could see into the main corridor, where enemy fighters were positioned behind improvised barricades, firing toward the conference room, where American voices were coordinating defensive fires and tactical movements. The situation was more complex than Sarah had initially realized. Her teammates weren't simply trapped in the conference room. They had broken out and were fighting their way through the building in an attempt to reach an exit. The enemy was trying to contain them while also dealing with the newly landed Marines who were advancing from the helicopter pad. Ghost positioned himself at a window that gave him a clear view of the main corridor and began engaging enemy fighters with precise, suppressed fire. His wounded shoulder affected his accuracy, but his experience and training compensated for the physical limitations. Each shot was carefully aimed and deliberately placed, creating confusion among the enemy forces who couldn't immediately identify the source of the incoming fire. Sarah moved deeper into the building, looking for a position where she could observe the larger tactical situation and coordinate with her teammates. She found what she needed in a supply closet that connected to the building's main corridor through a service window. Through the window, she could see Chief Rodriguez coordinating the team's movement, while Petty Officer Thompson provided covering fire from a defensive position near an overturned desk. 5 other team members were visible, all armed with captured weapons, and moving with the kind of disciplined coordination that marked professional soldiers under extreme stress. But they were also clearly running low on ammunition and had at least 2 wounded members who were slowing their movement. The enemy had numerical superiority and better positioning, advantages that would become decisive unless the tactical balance shifted quickly. Sarah activated the tactical radio they'd captured, hoping to establish communication with her teammates without alerting the enemy to the frequency. "Chief, this is Martinez. Ghost and I are in the building, East Maintenance Section. What's your status?" Chief Rodriguez's voice came back immediately, tight with stress, but maintaining professional calm. "Martinez? How the hell are you alive?" "Never mind. We'll discuss that later. We have 2 wounded, low on ammunition, and about 15 hostile between us and the exit. Marines landed, but they're engaged with enemy forces at the helicopter pad." "Understood. Ghost is engaging from the east corridor. I'm moving to support your advance. Can you break through to the main exit if we create a diversion?" "Affirmative, but timing will be critical. We need sustained suppression of the forces in the main corridor, and we need it in the next 2 minutes before they bring up heavier weapons." Sarah acknowledged and began moving toward a position where she could provide the required suppression fire. As she moved, she caught sight of something through an exterior window that changed her understanding of the entire tactical situation. Additional enemy vehicles were approaching the base from the landward side, at least 3 trucks carrying what appeared to be a full squad of reinforcements. The enemy force was larger and better organized than anyone had realized, and the Americans were about to be significantly outnumbered even with the Marine rescue force on the ground. "Chief, we have additional hostiles inbound from the north, Estimate 15 to 20 personnel in 3 vehicles. It may be 5 minutes. There was a pause before Chief Rodriguez responded, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of someone making calculations that involve life and death. Copy that. Everyone, we're out of time. Advance to the main corridor on my signal. Maximum aggression. No stopping for wounded. Martinez, Ghost, whatever you're planning, do it now. Sarah positioned herself at the corner of the main corridor and prepared to provide covering fire while Ghost maintained his suppression of enemy forces from the opposite direction. Through the windows, she could see the approaching vehicles growing larger, while from the direction of the helicopter pad came the increasing intensity of combat as the Marines engaged a larger force than they'd expected. The entire battle was approaching a crescendo that would be decided in the next few minutes. Either the Americans would break free and consolidate their forces, or they would be overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her remaining ammunition one final time, and prepared to find out which outcome her actions would create. As she did, she realized that her father's words about impossible situations had finally become clear. You didn't solve the impossible through superior tactics or overwhelming force. You solved it by refusing to accept that any outcome was acceptable except the one that brought everyone home. Execute, came Chief Rodriguez's voice over the radio. Sarah stepped into the corridor and opened fire. The engagement was brief, but devastating. Sarah's positioning allowed her to catch several enemy fighters in a crossfire between her position and Ghost's, while her teammates advanced with the kind of aggressive determination that comes from knowing there are no alternatives to victory. Enemy fighters tried to reposition to deal with the multiple threats, but the confined space and overlapping fields of fire made effective movement nearly impossible. Within 30 seconds, the corridor was clear and the Americans were advancing toward the main exit. But as they reached the building's entrance, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The enemy reinforcements had arrived and were deploying in positions that would cut off the Americans' route to the helicopter pad, where the Marines were still fighting their own battle. The tactical situation was approaching stalemate, with both sides having sufficient force to prevent the other from achieving their objectives, but insufficient force to achieve decisive victory. That was when Sarah heard something that changed everything. The distinctive sound of additional helicopters approaching, but these were coming from a different direction and flying in a formation that suggested a much larger force than the original rescue mission. Through the building's windows, she could see multiple aircraft approaching from the sea, flying in combat formation and escorted by attack helicopters that immediately began engaging ground targets with rockets and machine gun fire. Someone had decided that subtlety was no longer required and had committed significant resources to resolving the situation. The enemy forces, caught between the newly arrived air support and the Americans advancing from the building, found their tactical position becoming untenable. Enemy fighters began withdrawing toward prepared positions further inland, conducting a fighting retreat that suggested they had contingency plans for this level of American response. All American personnel, this is Marine Air Ground Task Force 7. We have close air support inbound and additional ground forces landing. Maintain your positions and prepare for coordinated advance on our signal. The voice over the radio carried the authority of someone commanding significant resources and the confidence that comes from having overwhelming tactical advantage. The rescue mission had evolved into a full-scale military operation, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. Sarah and her teammates linked up with the Marine forces at the helicopter pad, where a field medical station was already treating the wounded and coordinating the evacuation of personnel who required immediate medical attention. Ghost's shoulder wound earned him a priority medical evacuation, while the other wounded team members received treatment that would stabilize them for transport. As the helicopters lifted off with the wounded, Sarah found herself standing with Chief Rodriguez and the surviving members of their team, watching as Marine forces conducted a systematic clearing operation of the base. The enemy forces had withdrawn completely, leaving behind equipment and intelligence materials that would provide valuable insights into their organization and capabilities. Martinez, Chief Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and profound respect. I need you to know that what you and Ghost did today went beyond anything anyone could have expected. You saved lives that would have been lost, and you turned a catastrophic defeat into something we can learn from and build on. Sarah looked around at her teammates, all of whom were alive because of decisions made in impossible circumstances with no guarantee of success. She thought about Rodriguez, the traitor who betrayed them all, and about the enemy fighters who had underestimated the determination of Americans who refused to abandon each other. "Chief," she said finally, "my father always told me that impossible situations don't reveal who you are. They reveal who you choose to become. Today I chose to become someone who brings everyone home." As the sun set over the base that had become a battlefield, Sarah Martinez understood that some lessons could only be learned when everything seemed hopeless, and the only choice was between giving up and finding a way forward. She had found her way forward, and, more importantly, she had brought her team with her. The impossible had become inevitable, one decision at a time. 6 months later, Sarah would be awarded the Navy Cross for her actions during the battle at Forward Operating Base Serpent. But the award that mattered most to her was simpler and more personal. A photograph of 13 people standing together at Chief Rodriguez's retirement ceremony, all of them alive because someone had refused to accept that impossible was the same thing as insurmountable. In her speech at the ceremony, Sarah would quote her father's words about impossible situations. But she would add something he had never told her, something she had learned in the tunnels beneath a burning base while deciding whether to run or fight. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let impossible be the end of the story. Sometimes you have to insist on writing a different ending, even when no one believes it's possible. Especially when no one believes it's possible. The story of what happened at Forward Operating Base Serpent would be classified for decades, known only to the people who lived it and the families who welcomed them home. But for Sarah Martinez, it would always be the story of the day she learned that courage wasn't about being unafraid. Courage was about being terrified and choosing to act anyway, because the people counting on you deserve someone who wouldn't give up when giving up was the logical choice. That lesson would serve her well in the years to come, as she continued to serve in situations where the impossible was just another day at the office, and bringing everyone home was the only mission that truly mattered.